Chapter 11 of the Second Latchkey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney. The Second Latchkey by Charles Norris and Alice Muriel Williamson. Chapter 11. Annesley Remembers. There was great excitement for the next few days at Valley House and throughout the neighborhood, for the Annesley Setons made no secret of the robbery, and the affair got into the papers, not only the local ones, but the London dailies. Two of the latter sent representatives, to whom Lord Annesley Seton granted interviews. Something he said attracted the reporter's attention to Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Smith, who had been dining at Valley House on the evening when the theft was discovered, and Knight was begged for an interview. He was asked if he had formed an opinion as to the disappearance of the 3 heirlooms, and whether he knew personally Mr. Paul Van Vreck, the American collector and retired head of the famous firm of jewelers, who had wished to buy the vanished treasures. Having spent most of his life in America, Knight had the theory that unless you wished to be misrepresented, the only safe thing was to let yourself be interviewed. He was accordingly so good-natured and interesting that the reporters were delighted with him. If he had been wishing for a wide advertisement of his personality, his possessions and his plans, he could not have chosen a surer way of getting it. The 2 newspapers which had undertaken to boom the Valley House heirloom theft had almost limitless circulations. One of them possessed a Continental edition, and the other was immensely popular because of its topical illustrations. Snapshots, not so unflattering as usual, were obtained of the young Anglo-American millionaire and his bride, as they started away from the Knoll Hotel in their motor, or as they walked in the garden. Though Knight had disclaimed any personal acquaintance with the great Paul Van Vreck, he was able to state that Mr. Van Vreck had been convalescing at Palm Beach, in Florida, at the time of the robbery. He had had an attack of pneumonia in the autumn, and instead of travelling in his yacht to Egypt, as he generally did travel early in the winter, he had been ordered by his doctors to be satisfied with a place in the sun nearer home. Everyone in America knew this, Knight explained, and everyone in England might know it also, unless it had been forgotten. If Mr. Van Vreck were well enough to take an interest in the papers, he was sure to be amused by the coincidence that the things stolen from Valley House were among those he had wanted to buy. Knight thought, however, that even if the clever thief or thieves had heard of Van Vreck's whim, no attempt would be made to dispose of the spoil to him. The elderly millionaire, though one of the most eccentric men living, was known as the soul of honour. The relationship between young Mrs. Nelson Smith and Lord Annesley Seton was touched upon in the papers, and though it was irrelevant to the subject in hand, mention was made of the Nelson Smiths' plans to live in London. This gave Constance her chance. At an impromptu luncheon at the Knoll Hotel, before the intended dinner party at Valley House, she referred to the interests society would begin to take in this romantic couple. "Everybody will have fallen in love with you already," she said, "from those snapshots in The Looking Glass. They make you both look such darlings, though they don't flatter either of you. All the people we know will be clamouring to meet you, so you must hurry and find a nice house in the right part of town before some other sensation comes up and you're forgotten. How would it look if you took our house for a couple of months while you're looking round? Naturally, if you liked it, you could keep it on. We'd be delighted, for we have to let it when we can, and it would be a pleasure to think of you in it." "If we're in it, you must both come and stay, and not only think of us, but be with us. Mustn't they, Anita?" Knight proposed. Of course Annesley said yes, and meant yes. Not that she really wanted her duet with Knight to be broken up into a chorus, but she longed to succeed as a woman of the world, since that was what he wanted her to be, and she realized that Lady Annesley Seton's help would be invaluable. So, through the theft at Valley House, and the developments therefrom, the hidden desires of Nelson Smith and the daughter of the deposed Sugar King accomplished themselves, Connie still believing that she had engineered the affair with diplomatic skill, and Knight laughing silently at the way she had played into his hands. Detectives were set to work by the two insurance companies, who hoped to trace the thief and discover the stolen Fragonards and the jade Buddha, but their efforts failed, and at the dinner party given in honour of the new cousins, Lord and Lady Annesley Seton rejoiced openly in their good luck. "All the same," Constance said, "I should like to know how the things were spirited out of the house, and where they are. It is the first mystery that has ever come into our lives. I wish I were a clairvoyant. It would be fun." "Did you ever hear of the Countess de Santiago when you lived in America?" asked Knight in his calm voice. He did not glance toward Annesley, who sat at the other end of the table, but he must have guessed that she would turn with a start of surprise on hearing the Countess's name in this connection. "The Countess de Santiago?" Connie echoed. "No. What about her? She sounds interesting." "She is interesting, and beautiful." Everybody had stopped talking by this time, to listen, and in the pause Knight appealed to his wife. "That's not an exaggeration, is it, Anita?" Annesley, wondering and somewhat startled, answered that the Countess de Santiago was one of the most beautiful women she had seen. This riveted the attention which Knight had caught. He had his audience, and went on in a leisurely way. "Come to think of it, she can't have been heard of in your part of the world until you'd left for England," he told Constance. "She's the most extraordinary clairvoyante I ever heard of. That's what made me speak of her. Unfortunately, she's not a professional, and won't do anything unless she happens to feel like it. But I wonder if I could persuade her to look in her crystal for you, Lady Annesley Seton." "She's an old acquaintance of mine," he went on casually. "I met her in Buenos Aires before her rich elderly husband died, about 7 or 8 years ago. She was very young then. I came across her again in California, when she was seeing the world as a free woman, after the old fellow's death. Then I introduced her by letter to 1 or 2 people in New York, and I believe she has been admired there and at Newport." "But I've only heard all that," Knight hastened to explain. "I've been too busy till lately to know at first hand what goes on in the smart or the artistic set. My world doesn't take much interest in crystal gazers and palmists, amateur or professional, even when they happen to be handsome women, like the Countess. But I ran against her again on board the Monarchic about a month ago, crossing to this side, and we picked up threads of old acquaintance. She was staying at the Savoy when I left London." He paused a moment and added, "As a favour to me, she might set her accomplishments to work on this business, only she'd have to meet you both and see this house, for I've heard her say she couldn't do anything without knowing the people concerned, and getting the atmosphere." "Oh, we must have her!" cried Constance, and all the other women, except Annesley, chimed in, begging their hostess to invite them if the Countess came. No one thought it odd that Mrs. Nelson Smith should be silent, for her remark about the Countess de Santiago's beauty showed that she had met the lady, but to any one who had turned a critical stare upon her then, her expression must have seemed strange. She had an unseeing look, the look of one who has become deaf and blind to everything outside some scene conjured up by the brain. What Annesley saw was a copy of the Morning Post. Knight's mention of the Countess de Santiago's power of clairvoyance, at the same time with the liner Monarchic, printed before her eyes a paragraph which her subconscious self had never forgotten. For a moment only her body sat between a young hunting baronet and a distinguished elderly general at her cousin's dinner table. Her soul had gone back to London, to the ugly dining room at 22A, Torrington Square, and was reading aloud from a newspaper to a stout old woman in a tea gown. She was even able to recall what she had been thinking, as her lips mechanically conveyed the news to Mrs. Ellsworth. She had been wondering how much longer she could go on enduring the monotony, and what Mrs. Ellsworth would do if her slave should stop reading, shriek, and throw the Morning Post in her face. As she pictured to herself the old woman's amazement, followed by rage, she had pronounced the words, "Sensational occurrence on board the SS Monarchic." Even that exciting preface had not recalled her interest from her own affairs. She could remember now the hollow, mechanical sound of her voice in her own ears as she had half-heartedly gone on, tempted to turn the picture of her wild revolt into reality. The paragraph, seemingly forgotten but merely buried under other memories, had told of the disappearance on board the Monarchic of certain pearls and diamonds which were being secretly brought from New York to London by an agent of a great jewelry firm. He had been blamed by the chief officer for not handing the valuables over to the purser. The unfortunate man, who had not advertised the fact that he was an agent for Van Vreck and Company until he had had to complain of the theft, excused this seeming carelessness by the statement that he had hoped his identity might pass unexpected. His theory was that safety lay in insignificance. He had engaged a small, cheap cabin for himself alone, taking an assumed name, had pretended to be a schoolmaster on holiday, and had worn the pearls and other things always on his person in a money belt. Even at night he had kept the belt on his body, a revolver under his pillow, and the door of his cabin locked, with an extra patent adjustable lock of his own, invented by a member of the firm he served. It had not seemed probable that he would be recognized, or possible that he could be robbed. Yet one morning he had waked late with a dull headache and sensation of sickness, to find that his door, though closed, was unfastened, and that all his most valuable possessions were missing from the belt. Some were left, as though the thief had fastidiously made his selection, scorning to trouble himself with anything but the best. The mystery of the affair was increased by the fact that, though the man, Annesley vaguely recalled some odd name, like Jekyll or Jedkill, felt certain he had fastened the door, there was no sign that it had been forced open. His patent detachable lock, however, had disappeared, like the jewels. And despite the sensation of sickness and pain in the head, there were no symptoms of drugging by chloroform, or any odor of chloroform or other anesthetic in the room. It struck Annesley as strange, almost terrifying, that these details of the monarchic sensation should come back to her now, but she could not doubt that she had actually read them, and the rest of the story continued to reprint itself on her brain, as the unrolling of a film might bring back to one of the actors poses of his own which he had let slip into oblivion. She remembered how some of the more important passengers had suggested that everybody on board should be searched, even to the ship's officers, sailors, and employees of all sorts, that the search had been made and nothing found, but that a lady supposed to possess clairvoyant powers had offered Mr. Jekyll or Jedkill to consult her crystal for his benefit. She had done so, and had seen wireless messages passing between someone on the Monarchic and someone on another ship with whom the former person appeared to be in collusion. She had seen a small, fair man, dressed as a woman, hypnotizing the jeweller's agent into the belief that he was locking his door, when instead he was leaving it unlocked. Then she had seen this man who, she asserted firmly, was dressed like a woman, walk into his victim's cabin, hypnotize him into still deeper unconsciousness, and take from his belt 3 long strings of pearls and several magnificent diamonds, set and unset. These things she saw made up into a bundle, wrapped in waterproof cloth, attached to a faintly illuminated life preserver, and thrown overboard. Almost immediately after, she said, the life preserver was picked up by a man in a small motor launch, let down from a steam yacht. The launch quickly returned to the yacht, was taken up, and the yacht made off in the darkness. No life belt was missing from the Monarchic, and even if suspicion could be entertained against any small, fair man, which was not the case apparently, there was no justification for a search. Therefore, although a good many people believed in the seer's vision, it proved nothing, and the sensational affair remained as deep a mystery as ever when the Monarchic docked. The Countess de Santiago was the woman who looked in the crystal, Annesley said to herself. She wondered why, if Knight had been vexed with the Countess for speaking of their friendship and of the Monarchic, as he had once seemed to be, he should refer to it before these strangers. She looked down the table, past the other faces to his face, and the thought that came to her mind was, how simple and almost meaningless the rest were compared to his. Among the 14 guests, 7 women and 7 men, though some had charm or distinction, his face alone was complex, mysterious, and baffling. Yet she loved it; now more than ever she loved and admired it. The dinner ended with a discussion between Knight and Constance as to how the Countess de Santiago could be induced to pay a visit to Valley House, despite the fact that she had never met Lord and Lady Annesley Seton. Like most women who had lived in Spanish countries, the Countess was rather a stickler for etiquette, her friend Nelson Smith announced. Besides, her experience as an amateur clairvoyante made her quick to resent anything which had the air of patronage. One must go delicately to work to think out a scheme, if Lady Annesley Seton were really in dead earnest about wanting her to come. At this point Knight reflected for a minute, while everyone hung upon his silence, and at last he had an inspiration. "I'll tell you what we can do," he exclaimed. "My wife and I you're willing, aren't you, Anita? Can ask her to stay over this week end with us. I think she'll come if she isn't engaged, and we can invite you to meet her at dinner." "Oh, you must invite us all!" pleaded a pretty woman sitting next to Knight. "All of you who care to come, certainly," he agreed. "Won't we, Anita?" "Oh, of course. It will be splendid if everybody will dine with us." Annesley backed him up with one of the girlish blushes that made her seem so young and ingenuously attractive. "We can send a telegram to the Countess." She did her best to speak enthusiastically, and succeeded. No one save Knight and Constance guessed it was an effort. Knight saw and was grateful. Constance saw also, and smiled to herself at what she fancied was the girl's jealousy of an old friend of the new husband, an old friend who was one of the most beautiful women the girl had seen. Annesley's hesitation inclined Constance to be more interested than ever in the Countess de Santiago. End of chapter 11.